Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm your co-host, Dean Detloff.
And I'm your co-host, Matt Bernico.
Matt, Halloween just passed. We didn't say anything about it. We'll talk about some scary stuff later on in this podcast. But the scariest thing that happened to me is that I watched Game 6 of the World Series because our Toronto baseball boys are out there on the field, giving it their all against the LA Dodgers, the villains of the MLB. I've become a pretty big baseball fan in the span of just a couple short weeks. And I gotta tell you, it was a nail-biter. It was a scary game to watch, and they lost, which means tonight we have Game 7. And I'll be sending all of my occult energy to the CN Tower over the course of this podcast, and I invite you to do the same, because we're gonna have to collect it all at the top of that tower. The stadium is right at the base of the tower. And I feel like if we work together over the course of this show, even if we don't talk about baseball, I think that we could really contribute to a win, and that's going to be really important for me specifically today.
It's going to be so sad that when this podcast comes out, we'll know the result of that game, and if it's good, then it won't be sad. It'll be very positive. But if it's bad, all of this hoping and dreaming will look pretty embarrassing for one of us.
You know, that's the thing about baseball. It's both extremely exciting and a game of intense, unendurable suffering, I've discovered. When the bad guys score 3 runs against you right away by the second inning, and then you don't score any runs for a very long time, it hurts. I watched a baseball game, Matt, a week ago, and it started at 8 p.m. and it went till 3 in the morning, and I did not go to sleep until the end of it. So it has turned me into a goblin myself. I'm glad that it's happening around Halloween because it does feel like I'm slowly becoming a monster. But I wouldn't have it any other way, and tonight is my final chance to howl at the moon of baseball.
Wow. Well, root for the home team, and if they don't win, it's a shame. That's how the song goes. And I think it's true in this case. I just hope everyone's having a good time out there. I want everyone to have fun. I know that they're making a lot of money playing this great game, this great American and Canadian pastime. But I just want them to have fun. That's my biggest concern. So as long as they're having fun, they're winners in my book.
Yeah, you know, they are having a lot of fun out there, and I think everybody in Toronto is very proud of them. Win or lose, the Blue Jays will be heroes in the city, and that's great. If they win, there will be at least one sacrificial cop car for sure. I think the Toronto police probably have a duty to just park it downtown and kind of let people do whatever they want to it. That kind of happened after the Raptors won the NBA in 2019. So I think that is just kind of something we deserve. But even if we lose, I think there's still a pretty good chance that maybe the cop car wouldn't be sacrificial, but would nevertheless be destroyed. Mm-hmm. So I think it's going to be an exciting expression of pride either way. Speaking of cop cars getting destroyed, I also got to tell you, as with everything, deciding I have a new hobby means you've got to find the socialist angle on it. And I've done it, and wouldn't you know, there are actually a lot of socialist things to say about baseball. Fidel Castro famously had a very good curveball. He was good at baseball. He nationalized the Cuban baseball industry. Lots to say about that. The minor leagues, they unionized recently. The DSA in the U.S., it has an entire group of extremely funny baseball-oriented socialists. So I feel like it's a pretty deep vein. And listen, am I going to forget about baseball in a year from now? Probably. But right now, it feels like I'll never forget about it, and I'll be an extreme communist baseball fan. So just telling you, Matt, that you're going to have to prepare. I'm going to come with some baseball trivia in 6 months, and you're just going to have to live with that.
I do love the fact that Fidel nationalized baseball. An American pastime, I don't know, but it is certainly a socialist pastime, and that's great. Great for the socialists who do love baseball.
Yeah, I think so. And when we have our own revolution here in Canada and the Toronto Blue Jays are paid by the state to be our representation in the world as an expression of the victory of Canadian socialism, I'll be even prouder. But I'm proud of them even today.
That's so good to hear. This has been a segment on our podcast about sports, which is concerning. And now I want to do a quick shout out for all of the nerds out there, all of the inside kids who don't enjoy baseball. And in this shout out, I want to try to sell you a book. And that book is called Enough is Enough, Degrowth, Capitalism, and Liberation Theology. It's by Dean and I, and it's now available for pre-order from the Fortress Press website, or from bookshop.org. It's also on other websites too that I don't want to mention or encourage you to find them on. So, anyways,
websites that we criticize in the book ourselves.
That's true. Websites whose boss makes them pee in a bottle. You know which one we're talking about. Don't buy it from them. But buy a copy and then do send it to the boss of that company. That would be weird. And I'm sure they wouldn't read it, but that's fun. Cool. Anyways, you should do that. You should also another quick shout out for the Inside Kids. If you're not playing baseball, if you want to be inside reading books, the Magnificast Discord is currently reading a very great book that is extremely on brand for what we're talking about this week. We're reading the book The Long Heat by Andreas Malm and Wim Carton, a book about climate change and adaptation. So anyways, read the book that we have written. Well, you can read it after you pre-order it and then it comes out. Or you can join our Discord. You can join it on our Patreon, by the way, and read a book with us about climate change now. So many options. If you're an outside person, you can watch baseball. If you're an inside person, you can read books with us. We're covering all of the bases on this podcast.
That's right. The bases are loaded. And I got to tell you, Matt, I'm supremely indoors. I'm a big indoor boy. And I just want to reject the harsh and difficult opposition you've made. I think it's undialectical. I think that we need a true synthesis between the outside and indoor, boys, girls, theys, and thems. And I think that is exactly what socialism will achieve. We will finally, like we overcome the contradiction between the urban and the rural, the worker and the boss, we will also overcome the indoor-outdoor contradiction. So anyway, that's my my appeal to all of you who also are baseball enjoyers and nevertheless will also read our book. And I think that for marketing purposes, we need to really get our metaphysics straight.
I'm so sorry for doing for doing a big accidental reactionary politics on this podcast. Speaking of reactionary politics, Dean, this week, you're gearing up to go to Brazil, to go to COP30 and attend and see what's going on there. So we thought we would have a bit of a conversation about COP30 this week. I think that in previous years, we've also talked about it on the podcast. Sometimes we've talked about it as it's been happening, sometimes until long after it was over. But this time we're getting ahead of the game and pouncing on it early to talk about COP30. COP is always such a weird thing. Dean, you're going. I'll let you say something about it. What is COP and why do people care about it?
Man, such great questions. I should say I'm going for work, but my opinions about this absolutely do not reflect the opinions of my employer.
Extremely
or
important.
If they do,
yeah, great.
That's a great happy accident. In any case, these are my own specific opinions. The first thing I'll say about COP is that all cops are bastards, as they say. We all know this, and that goes for these COP meetings too. COP stands for the Conference of Parties. It is a meeting organized by the United Nations. It's COP30 because it's the 30th one. And it's a meeting to talk about climate change and what they're going to do or not do about it. Usually a mixture of both. And the last couple of COPs have been in fossil fuel petrostate countries. And the fossil fuel lobby has been increasingly effective at lobbying the COP. But the COPs have not been without, some language from civil society that seems to have broken through. Last year, for example, in Azerbaijan, there was a commitment to phase out fossil fuels, which was pretty surprising to a lot of people, myself included. That's great. There's a lot of talk about a just transition. There's talk about 1.5 degrees. In fact, the Paris Agreement, which also happened 10 years ago, which is one reason that COP30 is a big deal this year, that is the agreement where we got the 1.5 degree target. That is to keep the global temperatures below 1.5 degrees higher than they were in pre-industrial times. So, it's a place where governments get together and they negotiate and they agree to targets, they agree to spending, all kinds of different stuff. And it's a mixed bag because sometimes the demands of civil society kind of make their way into final statements. That being said, the good stuff that happens at COP is almost always underfunded. It's not binding, or at least if it is binding, nobody cares, and there's no way for the UN to make them care. It's a pretty embarrassing show of people coming to a place to say, we're going to do something really big and important and ambitious about climate change. And then they go away and they don't do that. They do the opposite. They double down on fossil fuel extraction. They open new oil wells, as Joe Biden did, or as Mark Carney here in Canada is doing, doubling down on the fossil fuel industry. So the COPs are interesting, complicated, frustrating. They're official spaces where governments talk about climate change. They're also spaces where civil society kind of meets each other. And maybe that's the most important thing to say. I think COPs are basically frustrating in this one. We'll talk more about what's specific about it, but it will also be frustrating, inevitably. But more importantly, the COPs are kind of a place where civil society connects and networks and gets to know each other and complains to governments, but also kind of stages demonstrations and shares tactics and strategies. So, it collects the annoying, like, lanyard energy of governments, but it also collects the more, I don't know, the rabble of social movements. And that's why we're going to go. I'm going to go there to see both of those things and sort it out. Am I leaving anything out, Matt?
That all sounds pretty good. Yeah, that makes sense to me, what you're saying. I mean, just as I'm not going. Fortunately, unfortunately, I wish I could go to Brazil. I don't want to go to COP, but whatever, doesn't matter. I'm not doing either, so there. But just as an interested watcher, as a person who's always kind of tuning in to the news coverage, at least about COP, I have an RSS feed set up for COP just so I can kind of stay abreast of the conversation. The thing that's always so bonkers to me about them is just like the glaring contradictions of COP. Like at the beginning of every one, Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, he will always say something big and dramatic, like in COP27, for example. He said that humanity has a choice. It's either a climate solidarity pact or a collective suicide pact. Great language, great rhetoric. Whoever speechwriter is, he knocked it out of the park. Cool. And then everyone claps and says, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Secretary General. And then they go on about their lives and they do not treat that as if they believe it's true. Or for example, last week, Antonio Guterres, he made another big statement saying that we have overshot 1.5, and that like this COP basically marks a failure, right? Like that every other COP, 29 other COPs have failed to produce the results needed to get, to constrain our emissions far enough to, stop the overshoot of climate goals and targets. It's not Guterres' fault that nothing happens. I mean, it kind of is. He's sort of responsible for a lot of things, but it's not like he can force governments of the world to do whatever. But the frustrating bit is just seeing everyone agree that there is a problem that can only be tackled collectively, and then that problem is met with nothing, really, or not nothing. That's unfair and not true, but it is met with less than what is needed.
Yeah, it is extremely frustrating. It's one of those spaces too where, like I said, governments will go there and they'll talk a big game. They'll be like, whatever, I'm the government of France and I understand that this is a pivotal moment, and because we had the Paris Agreement, we're so psyched to make sure that it happens. Like COP presidents in particular, the kind of like host country of the COPs, they especially want to like cement their legacy as a country that really secured something important for climate change. And so then they especially show up and try to, I don't know, whatever, create the ambition that they need and maintain it and so on. And then they, like I said, go home and just like don't do that or ignore it or do all kinds of things in contradiction to it or whatever. Donald Trump calls them on the phone and is like, I don't want you to do that. And so then they stop. And I think that is what is especially frustrating about COP. Pope Francis, we talked about it when it came out, but in 2023, he wrote an apostolic exhortation called Laudate Deum, which was ahead of COP28 in Dubai. And in that document, he talked about the kind of a similar thing. Like there's a disconnect between the ambition that everybody knows that we need. The scientists know it. The politicians know it. Everybody's talking about it. It's not a secret what is necessary. And nevertheless, nobody is willing to like step up and deal with it. And one thing that I do find helpful about that document, and it's something that we quote kind of a lot on the show, Pope Francis has a section in it where he says, you can look at all those situations at the UN, these kind of multilateral spaces from above, and you could walk away feeling like pretty disappointed. And I think we described Laudato Deum as like a very crabby Pope document. He's pretty crabby. But he says, nevertheless, there is what he calls a multilateralism from below. And it's premised, he says, on people in different countries in solidarity amplifying each other's call for justice. And that, to me, I think is also the opportunity of a thing like COP, that the multilateralism from above, we know it's going to fail. Guterres, his job is to try to make it succeed. The host governments, whatever, they're going to talk as though they're going to succeed, even though they will not. But the important thing is that the multilateralism from below finds a way to kind of congeal and build itself up. And one thing that is special about COP30, the last couple of years in Azerbaijan and then also in Dubai, those are countries that don't have a lot of space for civil society action. And Brazil is a space that has a lot of room for civil society and activism and so on. And I think people are looking at COP30 as like a moment to reinvigorate the climate movement and to show up. There was a huge wave of climate activity ahead of COVID. And that was also the moment when, Greta Thunberg was really rising to national fame, international fame. And there were all these climate strikes throughout the world and just, tons and tons of people, millions of people getting in the streets for climate. And then we all had to go home and not get sick. And since then, I think the climate movement has really struggled to find that mass energy again. And the COPs are not the things that are going to inject that. But I do think that COP30 in Brazil, given that civil society commitment, is going to at least be a moment to try to show up and be like, the climate movement is still here and wants to do something new. And to that effect, there's also, alongside the UN COP, there's what they're calling a people's summit organized by civil society, grassroots organizations, etc. And it's kind of like it's a parallel space for people to discuss, climate and other issues, connect with each other, organize together, etc. And there's also people who are kind of bridging the gap or, doing kind of inside-outside strategy between the People's Summit and COP30. So we can talk more about that later on, but I think that is at least also another kind of hopeful sign related to COP30. We can go through what's at stake at COP30 and what governments are going to talk about in a second. But I think, to me, what is most important, and the reason that I myself am going to travel to Brazil and stay there for a couple weeks and uproot my life and reorganize my whole situation in a really big and inconvenient way, the reason that I want to do that is because I do think that it's a unique and special moment for civil society to organize. And maybe one last point on that, it's also a moment for the church to show up. And the Brazilian church is so uniquely good at organizing. And there are so many kind of church movements that are going to be there that have already signaled, they're intervening, creating spaces. And I think that it's also kind of a moment for the church to be what's the liberation theology angle on all this stuff, on climate, on the COP, on the People's Summit. So I think that's also another reason I'm excited to go. It's it's not every day you get a big international conference that happens in a country like Brazil, one of the superstars of liberation theology. And I'm excited to see what the global Christian community has to say and how it's going to intervene in a space like that.
Cool. That is a legitimately exciting spin on this whole thing. I feel like we're doing a lot of Antonio Guterres slander. Not really slander, but he's out there doing the best he can at the UN. A former Portuguese prime minister from the Socialist Party. I don't know. He's doing his best. He's doing what he can. But yeah, giving that angle is really helpful. That seems a lot more energizing than people talking about finance and then and then not following through on any of it. Cool. Well, that's good. We can come back to some of the People's Summit vibes maybe in a minute. Before we do, though, we can talk about maybe some of the big themes and roadblocks at this COP that we should probably keep an eye out for. Man, sorry, you said all that stuff about liberation theology and the Brazilian church, and there's gonna be so much good degrowth content out of this, I bet. But we'll get there. We'll get there post COP, perhaps. For now, one important note about this COP is that the United States won't be there. That's, I guess, not surprising to most people. Back out of the Paris Climate Agreement, and won't be at this COP. Dean, has there been much conversation from the Canadian end of things about that particular thing that you want to share with us, at least? Maybe not. Maybe we can talk about it more broadly if not.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I do have information I should not share in this podcast.
Okay.
But there is a lot of interesting conversation in the international community more broadly that is, not something you can't share. Lots of like chatter between even NGOs and social movements and kind of interfacing with governments and trying to get a read on like, what is the US not participating? What does that mean? And I think that at this stage, you can say that either, depending on how the international community responds to that, either it could become an opportunity because the US showing up also means you have to deal with them, or it could be a huge liability because if the US doesn't show up, you have to anticipate how they would respond to you if you said something or did something. And I think the big challenge for the international community will be to find the courage to actually do something. In an interesting way, even when the US shows up and you have a liberal government, you can get some achievements with that. The Paris Agreement is a famous example. Barack Obama was very instrumental in getting the 1.5 degree agreement and all that kind of stuff. But the liability of that is that the US, even when Democrats are in power, will inevitably water down the ambitions of the global community, including the Paris Agreement, which civil society and scientists and others have consistently said is not enough and doesn't go far enough and so on. But the idea is like, if the US will give it to you, you'd better take it because that's probably the best that you're gonna get. And I think the fact that if there was a Democrat in office, if Kamala Harris was president and they sent people to Brazil, surely there would be some important gains and whatever, but also there would probably be a lot of pressure to not go very far or to kind of walk things back. So the fact that the US is not present at all means that countries can have a discussion without the pressure either of a conservative, Trump government like rapidly trying to stop you and block you from doing everything in an obstructionist way, but also without the pressure of like the kind of false promise of the liberals to be like, well, what if we all compromise to like take, half a step forward instead of like the full stride that we actually need. So that's interesting. The liability side of it is if you're a country that goes there and I don't know, you want to talk about the biggest fossil fuel emitter or carbon emitters and kind of fossil fuel states and all that kind of stuff, then the US, is far and away the worst offender. And it's hard to find the courage to talk negatively or constructively even about that without fearing retribution. And, I think that the Trump administration has shown that it can bully countries into modulating policy to not offend Donald Trump and all that. And the hope is that governments will, or negotiators, I should say, even more specifically, COP negotiators will take the opportunity and not be afraid of like the empty chair and what it might say or something. But that remains to be seen.
Cool. That's thank you so much for sharing your intelligence on what this may or may not mean. Whenever I think of, this is completely stupid, but it's our podcast and I can tell a stupid story if I want to. Whenever I think about US liberals and climate change, I always think about this one example that Andreas Malm pulls in his book Overshoot. So not the one that we're reading for the podcast Discord right now, but the one before it. And the story is about the conversation around keeping the 1.5 degrees Celsius number kind of in the climate mix. And, I'm sure that will actually come up again at this COP as well. But Andreas Malm has this example that he pulls from a G20 summit that met right after COP 27. So I think it was like in 2022 or something like that, where Joe Biden, along with a bunch of other leaders of G20 countries, they all met and they planted these like little sapling trees in Bali to make the number 20 for G20. And that was a solidifying moment in the keeping the 1.5 alive in the right after COP 27. It's a funny story because it's like a big symbolic gesture, and then immediately the next year in 2023, Joe Biden did open up new drilling in the Gulf of Mexico. So it's like, I don't know. I like the observation that maybe the United States not in the room is a net positive for other countries. That maybe different things could happen if people were, willing to take the step.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, I don't feel optimistic about that, but you never know. And like I said earlier, cops, they do offer surprises when it comes to rhetoric. The challenge is translating that rhetoric into action. And maybe that's a good moment to talk about some of the big ticket items at COP, like the things that people are watching for, what governments will do. So the in the last COP, in COP 29 in Baku in Azerbaijan, they agreed, the countries there agreed to what they called the new collective quantified goal, the NCQG. COP is really an alphabet soup. There's so many acronyms floating around. I guess this podcast is your glossary to figuring out how to read the news.
So take some notes, write these down. You gotta have your
that's right.
your cue card here for you.
That's right. The NCQG, the reason it's called a collective quantified goal is that the countries there collectively agreed to set a target for money that they wanted to spend in order to help developing countries fund their adaptation and mitigation related to climate change. And the developing countries showed up with a big price tag. They wanted over $1 trillion. And as you can guess, the other countries said, we don't want to give you $1 trillion annually, by the way. Not $1 trillion once. $1 trillion annually by 2035, so 10 years. The governments there were like, all right, we're not going to do that. What we will do is we will agree to fund $300 billion annually over the course of that decade. Sorry. Over the course of that decade. And then they set like a vague $1.3 trillion also to be funded over the course of that decade. But exactly who does it is not clear. Who's responsible for it? Nobody knows. So the $300 billion, that's supposed to come from public funds in a variety of ways. It could come from a government giving to another government bilaterally. It could come from a multilateral bank or I don't know, like there are all these kind of regional banks that are publicly funded. It could come from the public sector mobilizing the private sector. A lot of really just like lack of interest in governments acting like governments. And that's for the $300 billion. So not a great start. And the rest of it, the majority of that, more than 3 times that amount, that's all supposed to come from, I don't know, who could say, from some rich people who decide that they, out of the goodness of their hearts, want to give money to developing countries for climate reasons. Like, it's a lot of magical thinking. And Brazil, they were like, let's up the ante a little bit. So now it's going to be $310 billion annually. An extra $10 billion is really going to kick things forward. But they still have this 1.3 trillion goal by 2035. So the NCQG is supposed to guide discussions on how and what is financed coming out of COP30. So there'll be a big finance side of it. Also, lots of questions about how that money is given. For example, is it given in the form of grants? Is it given in the form of private investments that expect to profit? Is it given in the form of further debt-creating instruments, as they say, or loans, as you might say, in a situation where the world is already suffering under a sovereign debt crisis? So that is all going to be up for debate. And one piece that's related to this, and then I'll pause and we can talk about how annoying this all is. Countries said that they would submit what they called NDCs, or nationally determined contributions. The NDC is supposed to be a country's plan, basically, for how they're going to meet a range of kind of like measures. Like, what are they going to do to keep the global temperature under 1.5 degrees? So the NDC is the plan that each country has to reduce their emissions, to offset it, to contribute to climate financing, etc. And the deadline has already passed, and countries did not meet it. Surprise. And there have been some, like Canada, to its credit, they submitted their NDC in February, but it was like extremely disappointing. Not nearly enough money that's going to be spent. Lots of wiggle words of like, what does that even mean? Things like that. But all these countries are going to get there. They agreed. We're all going to submit our NDCs. They didn't meet the deadline. They're going to have to negotiate those NDCs. And in particular, with reference to the 1.5 degree target and this NCQG that I mentioned, how are they going to make up for that $310 billion annually? And I got to tell you, Matt, if you ask me, I don't think that they're going to do it. All signs point to failure. They do not seem to be putting their best foot forward, and so much the worse for the rest of us, because this is the planning required to meet the already challenging goal, like the already insufficient goal of keeping temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius.
Yeah.
So those are a couple big ticket items. There's others, but I'll pause there or else I'll just keep talking forever.
Yeah. There's so much to say about it all. Not much positive. I was trying to think about that 1.3 trillion number, and I was like, okay, what is that relatable to? And the biggest comparison, or the best comparison I could find, was the U.S. military budget. In 2024, the U.S. military budget was $842 billion. So not quite a trillion, but like pretty close. In 2022, it was 1.5 trillion. So that's a little bit more. So anyways, it's like the idea is like the U.S. military budget every year annually until 2035. I mean, it's a big ask, but given the severity of the situation, you'd think, well, like, what else are you gonna do? I mean, it's that where then like huge swaths of people will die, and I hate to say it, but like, capitalism is going to choose a huge swaths of the people to die. Very frustrating. Yeah, I have some more things to say maybe, but anything else about those big numbers?
I guess for people who want to watch COP or follow it in the news, they're going to review the NCQG, but this is a lot of like moving deck chairs on the Titanic kind of stuff. Like nobody's going there talking a huge game about like, we're going to go, we, Canada or France or Germany or the UK or whoever, we're going to go there and we're going to find the ambition necessary to like meet this target, either to meet the billions or the trillion target. And it's frustrating to watch because people are like, well, don't worry, we'll talk about it. And it's like, well, you already talked about it and you did a bad job. And now you're going to talk about it again. This is the 30th COP.
Yeah.
It's the 10th since the Paris Agreement. And last year was the first year where global average temperatures were over 1.5 degrees Celsius. So, it's like there's a lot riding on it and not a lot of ambition ready to meet it.
Right. Okay. That sucks. To heap more things that suck on top of that, I was thinking, okay, there's all these questions about finance and money and like who's paying for it. All great questions. But then I was thinking, what is that money for in particular? Even $310 billion or $310 billion. Were that money raised, what would it be spent on? I guess is the question that I would like to know the answer to. And I was just kind of digging around a little bit, trying to find some things that I could kind of answer that question with. So here's at least one answer. Andre Correa do Lago, who is the guy who has been appointed by Lula to preside over COP30. He is also the Secretary of Climate, Energy, Development, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Brazil. A guy with two different jobs, two big ones. About COP, he said that he wants this COP to be remembered as a COP about adaptation. And that is what a lot of that money is kind of being geared towards. Money so that global South countries can build seawalls, relief for when giant storms come through, like the one that just went through Jamaica and Cuba. Adaptation is completely necessary. Don't get me wrong. Do not get it twisted. You got to adapt to climate change because climate change, if you haven't noticed, is happening. Like you just said, last year alone, we reached 1.5 degrees warmer than normal. So it's important to think about adaptation, But the difficulty with adaptation is that, it's not it's not going to tackle the underlying issue, which is carbon emissions. So adaptation is extremely good. Again, do not say I'm not saying that. It is good. It's so important. But it is not focusing on the thing that is causing, the situation that has to be adapted to. And I guess that is part of the frustration for me, is that all of these conversations are important and necessary, but we're not going to get to the bottom of it, which is a capitalist system that's hinging on growth at the sake of everyone else on the planet, which is extremely dark.
Yeah, it is. And also, I mean, the adaptation piece, as you're saying, like, it's necessary, but it is basically just kind of, it's a little bit of a giving up moment.
Yeah,
it's just being like,
yeah.
well, I guess it's here and we're going to deal with that. A couple other just like quick headlines that are also related to that about things that will be negotiated at COP. So Brazil has the presidency of it. It's great that it's Lula and not Bolsonaro, but there have been lots of controversy around it. It will be held in Belém, which is a city on the edge of the Amazon, on purpose. Lula wants to like highlight the Amazon as a biome as people think about COP, but there are many contradictions. They are building like a giant highway through the Amazon to get people there, and just lots of insane stuff going on. I guess like you could say the vision of the presidency of the COP doesn't necessarily translate to the ambition of the participants at the COP either. So even if you have a more progressive government, it doesn't mean that you're going to have a more progressive outcome. And, there's lots of good questions civil society is raising about the kind of like the dissent of the global community on Belém and, the increased security forces in the city as a result, and all kinds of complicated stuff. So many contradictions happening there. There will also be talk about a just transition. A lot of civil society is trying to get a thing called the Belém Action Mechanism signed, which is a not bad necessarily, kind of commitment to do a just transition in a just way, like without more debt, with concern for workers, with an understanding of the costs of, critical minerals mining, all this kind of stuff. But that is also going to be a pretty hard thing to achieve. But you might say that's like an institutional demand of civil society. So there are non-institutional demands, which are, whatever, fix climate change, things that don't have like maybe a hard policy edge to them. But the BAM, the Belém Action Mechanism, is one attempt to translate stuff into policy for better and worse with all the compromise that comes in. It's not calling for the end of capitalism, for example, but it's going to call for some other stuff that's very important. There's also going to be lots of talk about climate finance. That's been a big ticket thing on the last few COP agendas. All this stuff is going to get talked about or not talked about or whatever. But I wonder if maybe this is actually the moment to pivot to talking more about the People's Summit and kind of what the church is doing and what social movements are doing there. And maybe I'll ask you, Matt. Matt did the good hard work of researching what liberation theologians are saying, and they'll be saying a lot more coming up soon. But there's a good Leonardo Boff blog, I guess a repost, but nevertheless, some insights that we can take from it.
Yeah, that's right. Leonardo Boff has been posting not about COP in particular, but he's been doing his thing about ecology and the environment and liberation theology for a bit. He's definitely kind of revisiting those, I think, given the subtext of the situation. But actually, rather than Boff himself, he reposted a blog from another, not liberation theologian, but another fave of the podcast, someone who've talked about quite a bit. Boff posted a blog from Michael Lowy. You might remember him as the author of the book War of the Gods, and he's also written a bit about degrowth. What else has he written, Dean? Was there another book that we talked about from him? I can't remember.
He's written a lot of stuff about Walter Benjamin and Romanticism and literature and Marxism. I guess we could say a little bit more about him. He is Brazilian himself, though he teaches in France. He comes from a kind of Trotskyist, Marxist tradition, for better and for worse, but he's better than some other Trotskyists for sure. He is not a Christian. He is of Jewish origin, but what that means, I guess, is complicated. But he, in terms of like being a person of faith or whatever, he's a guy who's into Walter Benjamin. I guess that's what I'm trying
Enough
to
said.
say. Yeah, he though is a very strong like advocate of liberation theology, observer of it. He met with Pope Francis on behalf of like a delegation of like Christian Marxist dialogue in France. So a very interesting character and somebody to look at for sure.
Yeah, exactly. Not like a liberation theologian in the way that Boff is, but also a person who's contributed to the conversation in a big way. Read War of the Gods. It's a good one. It's a good book. We've talked about it in the podcast probably years ago now, but it's cool. Anyways, it's actually kind of sweet the way that Leonardo Boff posted this on his blog. He gives like a quick introduction to who Michael Lowy is, and cool. But in the little introduction, Boff says, with him, Michael Lowy, I have a fruitful dialogue almost weekly. He sent me his article in French, and now I've republished it. And I'm ready for the Leonardo Boff, Michael Lowy podcast. I want that one. I want them to start recording their conversations, and they can. I would subscribe to their Patreon for sure. But it doesn't exist, so this is the next best thing, I guess. Anyways, Michael Lowy wrote a really brief sort of blog about COP and adaptation and some of the big themes that we've been talking about. But I think it's a great highlight of the issue I was mentioning a minute ago, but also I think about some of the conversations that are probably going to start happening around COP as well. So this is not the beginning of the bit from Michael Lowy, but it's a bit down in his article. Sort of just I want to put the adaptation stuff up front because it seemed to be the most interesting.
Yeah.
Anyway, so Lowy says COP is giving priority to adaptation instead of prevention, and it's a indirect way of resigning to the inevitability of climate change. It's a speech that is heard more and more among the rulers of different countries around the world. The logic of this argument is simple. As it is impossible to do without fossil fuels, globalized transport of goods, industrial agriculture, and other multiple economic activities responsible for climate change, but necessary for the proper functioning of the capitalist economy. We only have the possibility of adapting. Down towards the conclusion, he says, if COP30 privileges adaptation over prevention, it will remain in people's memory as a COP of capitulation. A big one. And then at the very end, there's a little bit of hope, though. He says, fortunately, COP will meet in Belém at the same time as the People's Summit, in which environmentalists, peasants, indigenous feminists, eco-socialists, and other movements will also participate. They'll discuss the true solutions to the ecological crisis and take to the streets of Belém to protest the inertia of governments and affirm the need to break with the system. They are future sowers who refuse resignation and conformism. So a good word at the end. It's we either have on one hand the COP of capitulation, or we have the People Summit, who are the the future sowers. I like that. It is, but anyways, I think that is that's the state of things, right? You have people who kind of like are demanding something actually change on the one hand, and then other people who are pretty happy to just rearrange the deck chairs in the Titanic on the other. So hoping for the best for COP30, but it feels not great.
Yeah, I mean, definitely you can hope for whatever you want, but expecting the best is something you should not do. That's my professional opinion for all those listening out there. But I think that it's true. The hope is in the People Summit side of it. And in addition to all those good folks that Michael Lowy mentioned is the church. So there are so many church organizations that have mobilized to be in Belém. We talked a little while ago about this document that came out from the bishops' conferences of Africa, Asia, and Latin America ahead of COP30, which recommends degrowth and many other things. And the church, I think, has kind of had like a long runway to figure out how to show up in Belém in a really important way. We're seeing a lot of church leaders go to Brazil. Cardinals from all those continents will be present in the country, and in Belém in particular. There are a lot of what are called pastorals, which are kind of like, we don't really have them so much in the global north, which is too bad. But they're like social movements that are sponsored by and organized by the church specifically. So one of the most famous is called CPT, which is I forget what it stands for in Portuguese, but it's a very famous social movement, pastoral movement in Brazil that basically accompanies landless workers and people working on the land, peasant farmers, etc. They work a lot with the MST, the landless workers movement there in Brazil. These kinds of movements are the kinds of movements that will be present on the ground. And I think because there's been a lot of talk about like the I don't know, the like decrease of liberation theology in the early part of this century, in the early 2000s. I think it'll be interesting to see kind of how that tradition shows up, especially after the death of Pope Francis. And now we have a second Pope from the Americas. What will the church kind of say? And there's a huge open door, coming from the hierarchy, from the bishops themselves, basically calling on the church to form a North-South coalition capable of making more ambitious demands. And I think that for me, like, that's going to be the most interesting thing. There will be a lot of journalism about COP and the climate stuff, the political stuff, finding the will for it. There will be a lot of good stuff on the People's Summit and what happens there and what do the demonstrations look like and the workshops and all that kind of thing. But to me, the thing that maybe that I hope people will talk more about is what does this mean for the church, and what is the kind of Christian result, I guess, of participating. And it's not only Catholics, like the World Council of Churches is going to be there. The Anglican bishop in Belém is very progressive and has been doing a lot of work already to like call together a lot of church actors, which is really cool to see. Lots of other Protestants sending representation internationally, and I think that there's a lot of will to like have an inter-church, but also wider interfaith conversation there. So, like, it's going to be a moment. And the other kind of interesting piece of all that, there's a church conference. So this is like some weird Catholic inside baseball stuff, but the World Series is on, so I'm going to give you the inside baseball. You might know that there are bishops' conferences usually organized according to countries. So there's a Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops. There's a U.S. conference. There is, one in the UK. There's one for the EU, but also ones for Germany. There's one for Quebec. But in general, they are divided by some kind of national border. And that is kind of an accident of history. Bishops' conferences didn't really exist before the 20th century. They emerged over time, and, in some cases, they're extremely powerful and interesting. The Brazilian Bishops' Conference is one such conference. In other cases, they're more like professional associations, or, I don't know, just kind of like ways for bishops to compare notes and stuff. One thing that's interesting, though, is after the Synod on the Amazon that Pope Francis initiated, there has grown up a church conference, an ecclesial conference, based around the biome of the Amazon itself. So not nationally determined, but determined by an ecological boundary. And it is also interesting because it's not only bishops. There are bishops and cardinals involved, but also lay people, religious people, indigenous people, etc. And that conference, it's called CEAMA, but spelled CEAMA. That conference will be present in Belém as well, since Belém borders the Amazon. And I think that, like, the Catholic Church and other Christians have found a voice on ecology, but finding the institutional transformation necessary for, what Pope Francis calls an ecological conversion is pretty hard to do. So my hope is that COP30 actually is like a interesting moment for those experiments to like have their day in the sun and, like get some press out there about like what they're doing and proposing, and how those kinds of innovations in the church can maybe push the rest of the church forward in light of COP. So anyway, that's what I'm going to do. When I come back, I'll give you the great report back, the Magnificast journalism on what the church is up to in COP. That'll be my concern in particular. But I think that's the most exciting thing. In the midst of a lot of bad news and, anticipating a lack of ambition, it's also kind of cool to anticipate that it could be a moment of renewal and innovation on the kind of progressive Christian side.
Thanks for listening to Magnificast. If you like what Heritage supports on Patreon, patreon.com/the Magnificast. If you do join us, you can get into our very cool reading group where we're reading Andreas Malm and Wim Carton's book, The Long Heat. Or you can also just get into the Magnificast Discord and have a nice chat with everybody about squirrels and skeletons and spooky ghosts. Squirrelatons they're in the chat for sure. You can also pre-order our book if you want to. You can do it from the Fortress Press website, or just search the Magnificast book, and I'm sure you'll find it. It's called Enough is Enough: Degrowth, Capitalism, and Liberation Theology. Go check it out. I'm gonna stop doing so much book promotion, I think, just for a little bit. Well, we'll come back to it later.
That's fine. It's a long way till May 12 when the book does come out. But I think you've shown remarkable restraint, Matt. You had one big advertisement in the last episode, and then also a sneaky second advertisement, which I appreciated. You've got 2 in this one. I think you haven't worn out your welcome, but it's true. We're gonna find the most creative Magnificast way to push this book, and probably ads on a podcast star. Just only one way to do it.
I mean, some podcasts, you listen to them and they're like, buy a pillow, buy pre-packaged food for you to cook. And if you're consumers of those things, whatever, that's fine. But this is a book that you could buy and you could become so much more of an annoying person if you read it. And that's what you want. I know the audience of this podcast.
Okay. Look, we have done this podcast for almost 10 years, which is disturbing and insane. And over the course of those 10 years, we have never had an advertisement for anything except things like G's Magazine, or, I don't know, Ryan Cagle's weird stickers you can buy, or Ben Wildflower's cool prints that you can get. The kinds of advertisements that nobody has paid us to do and that we're happy to do because they're good in the world. And I feel like because we don't tell you to buy a pillow, because we don't tell you to, I don't know, find a therapist on the internet and we get 10% of what you pay them, I think that we have earned the ability to say you should go buy our book. So we're making up for some lost time. And listen, if you don't like it, you can write to our email and we will put it in the same folder where we put all the other people who ask us to have a Christian pastor talk on our podcast about their great golf game and their book about the Psalms, which is to say we will not read it, but you can send it there if you want.
You can say so many things about our podcast, so many negative and critical things, but we do have an unwavering level of integrity when it comes to not hawking weird stuff. So that's something. All right, folks. Our intro music.
Okay, Listen. Okay. Next year, we're gonna have to do a 10-year review. It's gonna be like our Paris Agreement review of this podcast. We're gonna figure out the new collective quantified goal of the Magnificast. And in that time, I feel like we do need to go through our email archive and find the weirdest things people have asked us to advertise, because we have had many requests for advertisements on the show, and we ignore or reject all of them. But there's some gems in there. So that's going to be some homework. And I'm promising you that, dear listener, in exchange for listening to us give you advertisements for our book, we will also give you some funny, weird trivia next year. So that's the deal, the contract that we're making with the listener right now, that I'll definitely remember when I get back from Brazil for sure, and will for sure not forget.
Just like the United States, I'm withdrawing from this agreement. No, just kidding. Our intro music is by Mario Armstrong. Our outro music is by Theological Spoon, and we'll see you next time. Dean won't be on the podcast, but maybe I'll do something different. Okay, bye.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early. Beside, what else are you gonna do? As we kissed in the alley by the Michigan Theater, fall snow was glowing in the lights of the downtown.